The new Broadway play Patriots just opened here at the Barrymore Theatre. Today, I'm talking with director Rupert Goold about the show, which examines how a larger-than-life oligarch helped Putin rise to power. The last time we saw you on Broadway was Ink, about Rupert Murdoch. You're back on Broadway with real-life people.
Yeah.
And powerful people this time.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
I mean, of course, people will see it and say, oh, Vladimir Putin on stage on Broadway, what does that mean? But the play really began with this other character, Boris Berezovsky, that Michael Stuhlbarg plays, and Peter Morgan came to me. I didn't really know Peter beforehand, but obviously only The Crown and Frost Nixon and all these great shows he'd done. And he said, I think there's a play here, I'd love it to see it at the Almeida, I don't quite know what it is. And it was very much about Boris, and that was very much what Peter was interested in. And about Putin and Putin's rise, but really about like the 90s in Russia. What I sort of underestimated when I was showing it to my team was how much people were fascinated by, the history of Russia, and particularly Russia in the 90s and after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then suddenly the Ukraine war happened, and this play that had been really fascinating became urgent. And the 2 years we've been doing the play, it has sort of been through the filter of the changing world events that we've been living through. And obviously just before we went into rehearsals, maybe even during rehearsals out here, Navalny died. And so that also became a kind of factor in the way we were putting it together. So this play that was a sort of history play has become a sort of current affairs play.
And I think that audiences definitely know or think they know about Putin, but they might not know as much about Berezovsky. So how do you explain who that is to audiences?
So he's the kingmaker. He's the man who made the man, I guess. He's the man who was a sort of the first super oligarch that came out of Russia, brilliant mathematician, sort of maverick, Jewish in a country where Jews couldn't hold power. He plucked Putin up and didn't really see what Putin was going to become, but thought Putin could become his puppet in some sense. And one of the things the play is interested in is, how do we feel about businessmen being our leaders? And of course, your country has just had that. Arguably, whatever you think of them morally, people like Bezos and Musk, and they're getting to the level of importance that state leaders are. So it's not such a strange idea to imagine a business community or even a business individual running a country. And it doesn't have to necessarily be populist. And I think Berezovsky probably thought he was a libertarian, but I think the play ultimately is going to be a call for democracy.
Tell me about the patriotism and nationalism at the center of the play.
Yeah, I mean, the play's called Patriots, and it looks at people who have very different ideas of what's the right thing for their country. And, one person's patriotism is another person's treason. At the heart, there's Berezovsky, who wants to see a massive liberation of all the restrictions that the Soviet Union, had under it, and really open up Russia to a totally free market experience. And then you have Putin, who wants to return Russia to its sort of former glory and assert itself as a superpower. Yeah, it sort of asks, what is it to love your country, and how do you express that?
Okay, we have to talk about the staging because it's spectacular and it just moves along so quickly. It's so electric. You have the actors on a platform with kind of bar stools around them, and you also have a lot of video. Tell me how you decided to stage it.
Yeah, I mean, Peter had obviously been arguably the most successful screenwriter in the last 5-10 years, and I think the play has a kind of filmic quality at times. A lot of locations, moves really rapidly, and for a director that's kind of challenging. So I wanted a kind of fluid composite space that could kind of move around, but also something that was metaphorically had some sort of resonance. And Miriam Buther and I, who designed the play, found some pictures of a nightclub in the 90s in Moscow that was a converted nuclear bunker that had been turned into this kind of neon-drenched kind of vodka-fueled, sort of glamorous, exciting space. And it felt like a really interesting metaphor. You go down all these floors in a former, pillar of Soviet Union power, a nuclear bunker, now this kind of crazy club. So that was kind of interesting reference, and I guess the set you see is kind of like that. The play begins when Berezovsky says, you think of Russia as a cold, bleak place, and we probably do, and I'm sure probably lots of parts of Russia are like that, but Peter's also trying to capture a side of Russia that is much more affectionate and soulful. And of course, if you're Russian now, I guess it must have been like being German in the 30s or something. You're the baddie. And of course, there are a huge number of Russian diaspora who have nothing to do with the regime, and who I think were really very moved by seeing Russians presented in a three-dimensional way that recognizes their country as a more complex place than just the strong man.
You have to tell me about the mirror center stage.
Yeah.
that Putin looks in
Yeah.
and kind of seems to try on some personas.
Yeah.
Is that what he's doing? It's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, it's the moment in the play when he first talks about flexing his power in a way that is, he says the state has a cudgel and he hasn't used it yet, but he will. Having said that, it's like something comes out, like the genie comes out of the lamp in some way, and he goes, maybe it's not just about being president, maybe it's about being emperor or czar, maybe more pertinently.
Wow, yeah.
And Peter had written the stage direction, he goes to the mirror and he looks in it and he starts trying out. Yeah, and it's funny because it's a slightly absurdist kind of, almost like Chaplin's Great Dictator kind of, you know, little man, Mussolini kind of posing. But the video work has sort of lifted it into this weird fracturing of self.
Now that the play is open, and now that it's where we are in current events, how do you think it's resonating with audiences?
I think obviously there are huge political resonances to do with how you can be asleep at the wheel and lose your civil liberties, and you know how to be vigilant about that. And I think there are resonances about what it means to be a superpower evolving. But I also think it's a Broadway play, and I think probably whatever they're coming for and taking away from it, I think the heart of it is the acting. I think really it's seeing really fantastic performances that are vivid and great writing for character, and seeing, yeah, kind of people knock lumps of it out of each other on stage.
Well, I can't let you go without asking you about Tammy Faye, which is coming to Broadway next season.
Yeah.
A little bit different than this.
Yeah, yeah.
But once again, real people.
Real people, yeah. It's written by James Graham, who wrote Ink that I did here just before the pandemic about Rupert Murdoch, and he always tends to write about real people. It's very funny. What I think James is particularly great at writing is looking at characters who maybe bridge political divides in a way, and Tammy was from a Christian movement that is was associated with the moral majority and conservatism, and yet she became this, you know, LGBTQ icon, and you know, was central to the sort of centering of AIDS discussion in this country. So she sort of is this strange hybrid, and kind of, but also involved in big financial fraud and corruption. You know, properly complex three-dimensional character. You know, definitely flawed, but with a big heart. And I think, you know, I find her as a character really moving. I think why I've always felt Tammy would be great over here is I feel it's like, yeah, like in a great diva musical comedy tradition that you get in Mame or Hello Dolly, or, you know, the classic musicals. And so we're really excited about bringing it out.